Welcome to The Screen Queen, the show where I'll be talking about your favorite show or your favorite movie. You'll just have to find out what you're about to know. This is your Screen Queen, your host, Samantha Parrish. I think Doug Walker said it best about The Lost Boys, that anyone who doesn't like The Lost Boys is a terrorist of fun. Hello there, this is your Screen Queen, and thank you so much for tuning in to the last episode of the Halloween series. So, I have to admit, I never really got into the whole vampire craze. I have a complicated relationship with vampires. There are some series that I do enjoy with vampire characters, or the whole story revolving around vampires, but it's just very seldom. They still didn't really do anything for me. It had to be a really good story to be able to get me to be okay with liking something that I don't really get into. When 2008 came along, when Twilight was the thing, there was either you liked Twilight or you liked Twilight. And because I chose the third party, it was not good times for me back then. For 5 years, I heard nothing about how much of a fool I was for not liking Twilight. There was definitely a target on my back for that time era because of not liking it. But then thinking back on that era, I kind of had to realize that Twilight was doing something for someone else, even if it wasn't doing it for me. It was someone else's cup of tea, even if it wasn't mine. And then when I watched The Lost Boys, and I have to admit it was basically the first vampire movie I ever really watched willingly, there was a different feeling I had towards it, and I didn't like it at first. It just didn't really get to me. I couldn't really get into it. I liked the atmosphere, and it was fun, but it just didn't really get me. And it probably didn't help the person I watched it with was a diehard vampire fan, so the stakes were raised. No pun intended. Well, maybe a little bit. Years later, Netflix comes up with The Lost Boys. And I'm like, I'll give it a shot. Why not? Let me see if I feel differently about this movie. Could I change my own mind about something that I don't normally get into? And then I watched it, and I accidentally loved it. This was the first change for me to like a vampire movie, and it's still a staple of all the things that I watched during Halloween. It is a fun time, and I had to kind of realize, well, why do I like this movie so much? This is like my Die Hard movie, essentially, where I can watch this without it being Halloween. And there are a couple things that I thought about that I'm going to dive into for this episode, so you better get your garlic ready and have your crosses on hand, because we're about to dive into the episode about The Lost Boys. With some of the snippets I mentioned with how vampires have impacted the media, I want to take the time to go back in history. So we're going to just get in our DeLorean and we're going to go back to 1931 when Dracula first came out. Now, Dracula was sold as the strangest love story ever told. I say that with utmost importance because of the way vampires have always been presented in the media. Whether you're a vampire fan or not, I'm sure you can kind of see some of these key elements that's always popped up in the marketing and the appeal for vampires. When Dracula first came out and Bela Lugosi became the icon, the permanent fixture of how vampires are presented in the media, I didn't really think about this until I began doing this episode that vampires didn't change for quite some time. If you really look at that era in the 1930s with the slick back hair, the long cape, but that became the sole identity. You had the same look of the slick back hair and the big cape, and you had that presented from Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee. If there was another vampire movie that came out, it didn't really hit because it wasn't the iconic thing. It wasn't a vampire that wasn't intimidating, didn't have the look, and didn't have the either scare factor or it didn't have the romantic factor. Understandable, it makes sense because that was the thing people wanted. People loved that, and looking at that, look at Twilight. People love Twilight for its thriller factor and the appeal of Edward Cullen, even though I don't get it, but he's someone else's tall drink of handsome, but he ain't my tall drink of handsome, and that's okay with me. Looking at that whole span, that's the way vampires have been portrayed. And then the Lost Boys came out in 1987 and basically just went ahead and made a whole new era for vampires. Don't quote me on this, but if it wasn't for the Lost Boys, then we would not have the vampires that we have today if it wasn't for this dramatic shift change to go and deviate away from the original way that vampires are made in the media. It's very rare to say this about a vampire movie, but this is truly a timeless movie. There are so many elements in this film that deviate away from the regular vampire formula while adding something new, but at the same time it does also homage a lot of things in the past, like the usual ways to kill a vampire, but it's done in a way as a comedic way, not really in a life on the line kind of way. It still does have its thrilling moments and some horrific moments, but that's not the main sake of the movie. When I look at The Lost Boys, I think of this as several different genres. I don't think of it as a horror movie. I think of it as a thriller. I think of it as a drama movie. I think of it as some elements kind of a comedy. It's not really like a laugh your pants off, but because some of these characters have quick quips and how it's able to make fun of the whole culture about vampires, it really is a universal film. I mean, can you ever really say about the other vampire movies, oh wow, I had so much fun watching Dracula? I'm sure there's some people that do, and they see it how they want to see it. Like I say in every episode, that you choose how you want to be entertained, but this is, all the way, a fun vampire movie. You know that a movie's doing something right if it's taking an element and taking it more than the way that it's proposed. But another great thing about The Lost Boys that I have to praise is it's one of the first vampire movies that has an amazing soundtrack. This is sort of a little bit known and unknown, but the director Joel Schumacher was selected for the Phantom of the Opera solely because of his music choices for The Lost Boys. Kind of a weird, like, hop, skip, and a jump, but something to think about when you watch The Lost Boys. When I first listened to the music on The Lost Boys, I was automatically in love. I'm already an 80s baby, and that was established in the last episode about the Silence of the Lambs, but because I grew up with 80s music, it was nice to get to hear music I had not known yet because it was associated with this movie. So it was kind of like this movie was my Indiana Jones, and I had to go through the Temple of Doom to go find my treasure. And damn, did I find some good treasures in this movie. When I first watched it, I loved the song Lost in the Shadows. But I sat there and I'm like, I know the singer. I don't know who it is, but I know I've heard this person before. And I showed this song to my mom, and she's like, I'm drawing a blank, Sammy. I don't know. And I'm like, Mom, you're the reason I love 80s music. You should know this. But at the same time, Lost Boys wasn't her thing, so it wasn't really going to be generating any association of what she would find familiar. So I did my digging, and I found the name Lou Gramm popped up, and another blank drawn. I'm like, I don't know who that is. And then I found out who that was. It's the lead singer of Foreigner. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Lou Gramm of the band Foreigner was recruited to do the song for this movie. And I'm like, I don't understand why this song doesn't go along with Foreigner. I'm sure that there's a main thing between music distribution because he's a solo artist and this does not have to do with Foreigner, but if they ever do like greatest hits of Foreigner, I hope they could kind of just squeeze this in there because damn, it's a great song. If you have never heard of Lost in the Shadows, oh my god, please pause this and go listen to the song. You'll be stuck with it, trust me. I have not been able to get the song out of my head for almost 10 years. I absolutely love it. It has such a good supernatural vibe to it that it can be listened to without being associated with the Lost Boys. That's how good it is. It's an amazing, underrated 80s jam. I do have to admit that one of the main factors that I watched this movie was because of Kiefer Sutherland. Basically, to me, that's my Edward Cullen. That is how I find vampires to be very interesting. Not alluring, but interesting. I like the character on David. I fell in love with his character, even though, man, he's the tall trick of Hanson back in 1987. Yes, indeed, he's making my Blanche come out. I like that his character, David, plays a fun vampire character. There's not an end game for him to have a romantic lead on. There's nothing really that makes him out to be the bad guy of bad guys, because this is a movie that keeps you guessing about what's going on with all of the vampires in Santa Carla. Again, gotta give credit to the world building involved and how David plays a part in how this fictional town of California works, being a nest of vampires, and how his character has made a lot of mischief. He's a one-of-a-kind character. He's not prestigious like Dracula, and he's not charming like Edward Cullen. If he was really charming, I don't know. I didn't read the book. But David's a cocky little shit. And that's kind of nice to see a character, a vampire character, that is going to be very methodical, but he's also cocky. He's going to do whatever the hell he wants, and does echo to the tagline of it having a Peter Pan inspiration. Peter Pan was quite cocky and did whatever the hell he wanted, and it does kind of tie well in a nice little vampire package. But there's also like a tiny little side note that I want to make about Kiefer Sutherland is his father was involved with one of the most classic horror movies, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And then years later, you have his son playing a part in what is now known as another classic horror movie. So in a way, it's kind of like a nice little family dynasty that this family is associated with the genre of horror, and they've made a mark on that genre. It's actually pretty cool, even though the Sutherland family did not really strike gold with any other horror movies. I think Donald went on to go do a couple other horror movies that wasn't the same as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and Kiefer did do a couple of horror movies that weren't really like The Lost Boys. But, gotta give the credit for effort. They are a very good family, and they are very good actors. I do love Kiefer Sutherland, what he brings as a interesting actor, but I don't think we would have had the career that he did if it wasn't for the way that he played David in The Lost Boys. And also, too, it really does help that the way that they created David made him iconic in the 80s time frame. So in a way, it's kind of like echoing that time period to make him a staple of that decade. Not just a character of the 80s, but a vampire character of the 80s. He became a Hall of Fame for vampire characters. But there's also something really important about The Lost Boys is, if it wasn't for The Lost Boys, there are many things in media that we wouldn't have. The way Joel Schumacher created a vampire movie, it did set the stage for his career. Because he did something different for vampires, because he showed his music taste, and because of his show of love for comic books, this led to him directing 2 Batman movies. His passing does make it very sad because on the cusp of everything, he really did bring a lot to cinema. He really does need more credit, and a lot of other critiquers and movie fans have been giving him the praise that he should have gotten when he was alive. And a lot of people start with The Lost Boys, with the very movie that he was given the reins to. He was 37 years old when he went from being a fashion designer to a movie director. He just went into hurtle to an entirely different creative department, and damn, he does a great job. Out of everything that he's made, Lost Boys, Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, Falling Down, A Time to Kill, The Phantom of the Opera, Trespass. He does bring something to cinema. And we wouldn't have all those movies, even though albeit some of them aren't celebrated, they still are a work of creation from Joel Schumacher, who went in it for not the money, but for the love of the game, the love of the art, the passion, storytelling, everything. He really is a artist to look to for inspiration for how he has a great work ethic. He has a great stride. And we're never going to get another Joel Schumacher. We really aren't. He had such a creative, unique vision that many will take inspiration from, but it's still sad knowing he is not here to see how much The Lost Boys has made an impact. There is a bit of irony at the timing of making this episode. I saw that CinemaSins had released a video about what they found to be wrong with The Lost Boys, and it's one of my favorite series. I have followed that channel for years, and I'm glad I watched that to echo more of their points about what they said about the movie, despite a lot of the stuff that CinemaSins creates is for the sole purpose of making fun of a movie. But the one thing that they praised that I never really saw in the whole grand pantheon of vampire movies is this movie was really good at subtlety and making things allude to what you think is going on. When we look at vampire movies, we see with some hesitation and some caution about how the vampire is going to go after their prey. Are they going to go vicious? Are they going to hypnotize? They have powers. Like, what's their game plan here? And we don't really see what they do quite yet. This is a movie where you don't really see a whole lot of biting. You see the fangs flare, and you know that they are killing people on the boardwalk, but you don't see them kill people on the boardwalk. You don't know entirely for sure if this, like, scrappy-looking bunch in the beginning are the entirety of the vampires that we're following for the movie, or if there are more out there. It even was mentioned in the video that the Frog Brothers could be vampires because we don't entirely trust the Frog Brothers quite yet. Excellent point that they made. And during some of the segments where people were being picked off of the boardwalk by the vampires, it is kind of silly but also very simple for the fact that they're being hoisted up from the air. You don't see them fly in because that would have deviated away and would have given away the mystery about what was going on the boardwalk with who really is a vampire and who's not a vampire. That's really the question you gotta ask yourself in this whole thing. And there's the security guard that gets yanked up and his car door comes with him. And then there's the couple and they rip the whole top of the car off. We didn't have to see it. They were just hoisted in the air and that was about it. There wasn't any money spent for blood or certain special effects. Really, Joel Schumacher was... Oh, God, I miss him so much. He did an amazing job with this movie. There's something that I forget about The Lost Boys, and that it's technically a franchise. We look at The Lost Boys and we go to the movie, but then the other movies don't really hold the same flame as what The Lost Boys did in the first movie. I mean, I gotta give credit where credit's due. It may not be a box office smash, but you can't help but not want to know more about these characters. I myself have not seen the second, third, and I didn't even know there was a fourth movie. I didn't know that was necessary. But The Lost Boys was still holding the torch. Corey Feldman's out there like, I'm going to keep going until they tell me to stop. Knowing all of these characters, you do want to know more about them. And it's amazing to know that they continued with these movies. They may not have been great movies, but we got more about the Frog Brothers. We got to see more of Sam. There is a little bit of David in there from what I understand, because one of the other Sutherlands took on the role of David because Kiefer was like, peace out, I'm not coming back, I'm sorry. And you do get more of the stories, and from what I found out over the years, that there was a lot that went into this world building. If we look at The Lost Boys, it was kind of like the base because of the different characters and their stories and wanting to know more about them. We did not get all of the answers, and that left room to expand their story in other outlets with the other sequels and even the comic books. I found out that there was a comic centered around Star and how her sisters, called the Bellas, are after her. And that does make a lot more sense to her story because she's a half vampire. She wasn't all the way there with how she was going to be a full vampire. And she was still trying to get herself healed, and naturally, because of her being involved with the Lost Boys, there are going to be people after her, so it sets more vulnerability and expands more in her character. And the same thing with the Frog Brothers. They also have more mentions in the comic books for how they became vampire hunters. I don't really know more about their story, so I can't really have this as concrete information. That's just basically what I got on the cusp of everything for how the Lost Boys expanded into an entire franchise. But this also begs the question, does this mean the Lost Boys is technically considered the second successful vampire franchise? And I'm including comic books and movies. I don't really want to specifically center on movies because there's more forms of storytelling. There's going to be novels and comic books and remakes and, of course, movies. So I can't just count out the other variables and factors that go into. So let's look back at Dracula. Dracula came out a long time ago, and that had its span. So that's technically the first franchise of vampires. And there really was no other prominent ones. Dracula is the first. And then you have the Lost Boys coming out, and that became the second franchise. And then you have Blade. And then you have Twilight. So in the entire cinema history of vampires, that's kind of like your head honchos. Dracula, Lost Boys, Blade, Twilight. There might be some more in there, but that's the only popular ones that I know. Even though they're all their own different kind of vampire. And that's a good thing. They're different vampires. Dracula was the base. Lost Boys became the different change of the vampire by not including anything with Dracula and expanding on a solo vampire story. And then you had Blade, the vampire hunter, and then you had that weird sparkly vampire that all the girls loved back in 2008. And that went on until 2012. So we have this entire layout of the timeline of the most popular vampire characters. And that kind of has to be said about what we do with the monsters in movies is how are they able to become their own characters? How are we able to see different breeds of this monster? And we got different types of vampires. We got different characters of vampires. When we look at Wolfman, it's kind of a touch and go thing with how they made a werewolf character and the rest of its story. Frankenstein's kind of a one-note monster, really, and they kind of do little things to his character, but vampires have always been very versatile. Even though they're not really the characters I care for particularly, but I definitely have to appreciate the way that they're created in the realm of fantasy and horror. I have to admit, I'm glad that I was proven wrong about vampires. I'm glad that The Lost Boys was my gateway movie into watching vampires. That even though they're still not the movie monster that I prefer, I do like that I can say I like a vampire movie. That this is my kind of vampire movie. It has everything that I love. The 80s, Foreigner, Kiefer Sutherland. It's got everything I need. And when we look at what we see in the media and wanting to share that with someone else, that they might not like that specific genre because they need to find it in their own way. They have to find what fits them. Twilight doesn't really fit me. That's not my cup of tea, as I've said several times. And Dracula, not so much. Like, I get what he's all about, but not my thing. And then Blade, I do enjoy those movies. But to see an actual vampire movie that's not centered around a superhero or anti-hero, this was a good introductory. This was like my way of getting into a vampire movie, and I can say that I do like a vampire movie. There's something to be said for all of us for how we will like things outside of our usual genres, but we have to find that thing that has those enjoyable elements. The Lost Boys has everything that I want, and admittedly, it's something that everyone wants too. It's a one-size-fits-all for anybody that can watch The Lost Boys and enjoy it for a vampire movie or just a fun supernatural movie, to enjoy it for the humor, to enjoy it for how it makes fun of the idea of killing vampires. There's so much to enjoy about this movie, and it really is a different kind of vampire movie that really will live on in time. They really do. Even though the characters might have a short-lived time span for the fact that they might not live forever, but this movie definitely did live forever. And that is a wrap on the Halloween series on The Screen Queen. Thank you so much for listening. This was spectacular, spooktacular really, to have a whole month as a entire special to devote to all things horror. It was so wonderful to be able to have that moment. I see that with other creators, and knowing that I got to create that for myself and produce it, and to see the responses, oh my god, it just makes me feel so happy, because it's been a rough month, a very rough month. And having this show and creating it, it's been a great distraction, and it's also been very fulfilling to actually get to do this. And I look forward to the future events that I'll be hosting. I do want to give a heads up that I am going to be taking a small hiatus for about 2 weeks. I am in the process of republishing one of my books. I've talked about it a couple of times on the show that I'm an author, and I wrote a book called Inglorious Inc., and I had to go through the process of republishing my book and sequestering it into 3 parts, and that's been a process. Let's just put it at that. And I kind of forgot about the human factor, that things happen in life, and it has pushed me back on a lot of projects. And in order to get this book out in early November, I need to take some of my time away from being a podcaster to devote my time for getting all the finishing touches done, doing the marketing, getting it published, and then there's the after marketing. It's a lot. I don't really have any words for it, and I find it kind of funny considering I'm an author, so I usually have to do a lot of stuff for what I want to do. I do appreciate those out there that are considerate and understand that it's a lot of hard work to do, that in order to balance all of these things as a one-woman show, sometimes time needs to be taken away from something else to concentrate on that one area. Whew! So, with that said, I am going to be telling you what your new episode is going to be, so that way you have something to look forward to when I return in 2 weeks. So here we go. Okie dokie. Let me go ahead and get this mixed up really good, and I've added a lot of new suggestions, so this is really gonna be quite a surprise to see what else is in here. Oh, I got one. Yep, I got one. I folded it way too good. I should just go into origami. Okay, that's interesting. Okay. I honestly didn't expect this, but we're gonna go with it. So in 2 weeks, your episode is going to be about cars. Yeah, it's an oddball pick, but we're going to get into it. Thank you so much for listening. Happy Halloween out there. And I will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Bye-bye!